Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins. In the long shadows of the Third Age, when the Dark Tower had fallen and Sauron's black will was scattered like ash upon the wind, Mordor stood silent. No fire burned in its forges, no banners flew from the shattered pinnacles of Barad-dûr. The Great Eye no longer watched. Yet the land did not sleep. Beneath its scorched earth and broken towers, something old stirred. Not all evil had perished in the ruin of the Dark Lord. Some lingered, small and bitter things like embers buried under stone. And some, it was whispered, still dreamed of fire far to the west in the green halls of Ithilien. The land once poisoned by war now bloomed again under the hand of King Elessar. But peace, as always in Middle East, was a fragile thing. The tale begins with a man named Kaldor, a Ranger of Gondor. Once a captain in the war against Mordor, now a scout tasked with keeping watch over the Blackland's borders. Many called him the Ash Walker, for he had survived deep forays into the Mortish wilds when others did not return. It was on one such patrol that Kaldor found something strange. At the edge of the plateau of Morgoth, where the land turned to glassy rock and choking dust, he came upon a half-buried orc standard. Black cloth torn, the emblem burned away. Beside it, half-crushed under a fallen slab of stone, lay the body of an orc. But it was not like the twisted goblins of old. This one bore armor newly forged, its blade honed, and its skin, though gray, was marked with symbols Kaldor did not recognize. And most troubling of all, the corpse was fresh. Someone, or something, was organizing the scattered remnants of Mordor's forces. He returned at once to Minas Tirith, his reports swift and grim. The king listened with furrowed brow, his hand tight on the hilt of Anduril. "We have buried the shadow once," Elessar said. "We will not let it rise again." But the realm was weary of war. Its strength spread thin. The king could not send an army, though a secret company was chosen. 3 souls, swift and silent, to travel into the heart of Mordor and uncover the truth. Not to conquer, but to find, and, if possible, destroy whatever threat grew in the dark. Kaldor was the first to volunteer. The second was Thrain, a dwarf from Erebor, stout and sharp-eyed, whose kin had long sought to learn if the orc hordes had left treasures buried deep beneath the foundations of Parad. Thrain claimed to seek only knowledge and gold. But Kaldor sensed in him a deeper motive, one not easily spoken. The third was a surprise to them both. Sared, a Haradrim woman, cloaked in red and bearing a spear of southern make. She had once fought for Sauron's armies, but after his fall, she had wandered the wilds alone, hunted by both east and west. It was said she had turned on her own during the Battle of the Pelennor, slaying her captain and fleeing into the mountains. Her reasons for joining were her own. 3 is too few, Kaldor had warned. 3 is enough to be unseen, the king had answered. And if Mordor breathes again, it must be slain in the cradle. So it was that the company set forth from the Afelduath beneath the cover of night, slipping like ghosts into the lands where no green things grew. The wind hissed across broken fields, and the stars above were veiled in ash. For many leagues they traveled in silence, speaking only when needed. The paths were cruel, and the air thick with an old, bitter scent like burnt bone and metal. Kaldor led them through the ruins of Niran, past the crumbled outposts of Sauron's slaves, where the soil had once grown crops for the armies of the Eye. Now nothing but black vines curled over rusted plows, and strange birds circled the skies, croaking in tongues no man knew. One night, as they camped in the shadow of a crag, Sur stirred from her watch and woke the others. "Something walks the plain below," she said. "Not orc, not beast. Something worse." They climbed the ridge, peering through the gloom. There, far off, a shape moved. A tall figure, cloaked in rags, with eyes that gleamed faintly like dying coals. It did not shamble like an orc, nor glide like a wraith. It walked with purpose, dragging behind it a heavy object wrapped in cloth. "What is it?" Thrain whispered. "A herald," Sared muttered, her voice cold. They used to roam before the war, bearing Sauron signs to his lesser lords, but they were all slain. "Perhaps not all," Kaldor said grimly. The figure vanished into the dark, but its trail remained. The company followed, careful and quick, weaving through ravines and pits where lava once flowed like rivers. At last they came upon a cave mouth where the signs of passage were clear. Scraps of cloth, a mark drawn in blood upon the stone, some sort of sigil shaped like a rising flame. Thrain hissed softly. "I've seen this before. Carved into a fallen vault in the deepest levels of Erebor. It's not orc work. It's older." Cal traced it with his hand. "Then we follow." And so into the dark they went, unaware that behind them, far across the waste, other eyes watched. Eyes that remembered the ancient songs sung in black speech beneath the mountains. Eyes that had not blinked since the fall of the tower. For in a hidden hollow beneath the ruins of Barad-dûr, the last forge fire had been kindled, and the shadow, long thought dead, had begun to whisper once more. They passed beneath the threshold of the cave as dawn broke upon the ruined spires of the Ephil Duath, though no light reached them in that place. The entrance was narrow, but within the passage widened into a long corridor carved by time and fire. The walls were scorched and brittle, the air foul with the lingering breath of old evil. Kaldor led with a torch clenched in one hand, the flame flickering uncertainly, as if reluctant to cast light upon such ancient stone. Behind him came Sared, her steps silent, her eyes never still, and Thra followed close, with axe in hand, muttering low in Kolto's stool to steady his heart. They moved cautiously, for the ground beneath them was treacherous, laced with fissures and half-concealed traps laid by hands long since turned to dust. Yet there was no dust upon the path they followed. The stone showed the scuffs of boots, the drag of something heavy, and here and there a dark smear that might have been blood, though the torch's glow could not confirm it. They were not the first to pass this way. That knowledge clung to them like a damp cloak, and none among them gave voice to their thoughts. At length they came to a chamber half cabased, its ceiling fallen inward and blocking the main way. Great blocks of obsidian rock lay tumbled like children's stones, and among them bones, many of them shattered, spoke of something violent and recent. Thra knelt, running a gloved hand over one of the skulls, and his brow furrowed deeply beneath his helm. "These were not killed by blade," he said, his voice low but steady. "This one was crushed by falling stone, or by something worse. The bones are twisted, broken, as if by great force, not orc work." Aluldra's eyes were on the far wall, where the fallen rocks did not quite seal the space. A narrow gap remained, just wide enough for a man to pass. Beyond it, he saw faint light, lit and shifting like the reflection of a forge fire upon stone. He said nothing but pressed forward, squeezing through the narrow space until it scraped his shoulders. The chamber he entered was vast and strangely warm. Its walls were smooth and black, and in its center stood a platform of carved basalt, upon which rested a great cauldron-shaped basin filled with smoldering coals. From it rose heat and a dull red glow that pulsed like the beating of a heart. But it was not the basin that held Kaldor's gaze. It was what lay beside it. Upon a slab of dark stone, bound in iron bands and wrapped in cloth now half burnt, lay a body, or rather the remains of one. It was large, larger than any man, and its skin was ashen gray, veined with black lines, as if it had been scorched from within. Its face was concealed by a helm of dark iron, shaped like the snarling visage of a beast, and its chest was pierced through with a blade, the hilt still jutting from the wound. Care did not move, but every sense screamed caution. He had seen death in many forms, but this was different. This body had not been left here in defeat. It had been sealed, imprisoned. Behind him, Sir slipped through the gap and froze at the sight. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper thick with dread. "Oscar rule." Thrain pushed in after her, panting and wide-eyed. "What did you say?" "It is a name from the south," she answered slowly. "A war archief of the ancient days, before even the Dark Lord rose to full power. He was a servant of Morgoth, a smith of twisted metal and darker sorcery. Sauron sought to raise him once, but the attempt failed, or so we believed." Kaldor's hand rested on the hilt of his sword. Failed, or was abandoned. They circled the chamber, finding signs of recent movement. Ash disturbed, cloth torn, and footprints heavy, booted, leading away from the slab, toward a side passage hidden behind a low arch. The trail was not alone. There were others, smaller, clawed, the tracks of orcs or goblins, though many were smeared as if dragged. "They've taken something," Thraw muttered. "Or someone." "No," Sarah said. "They've awoken something." As if in answer, a distant rumble echoed through the stone, a low, guttural growl that seems to vibrate in their bones. The flame in Kaldor's torch danced wildly, casting monstrous shadows across the walls. And from somewhere far below, a horn sounded, deep and cold, a sound not heard since the war. "We must go deeper," Kaldor said, his voice as firm as stone. "Whatever stirs down there, it must be stopped. If they mean to raise this Asgar, we cannot let them succeed." "But if he has already risen?" Sared asked. "Then we end him again," said the ranger, "whatever it takes." They pressed on, descending the side passage into a narrower hall, the walls etched with runes of fire and command. Sarah translated as they moved. This was a place of forging, of binding, not for weapons alone, for spirits. "So the smithy of a dark heart," the rain said, his voice hushed. At the end of the hall stood a gate wrought of black steel and marked with the same flame-shaped symbol they had seen on the surface. But this was no ordinary flame. It was crowned with a single eye. Not Sauron's, but something older, wilder, filled with wrath and hunger. They paused before the gate, uncertain. Then a voice spoke, not loud, not booming, but clear, cold, ancient. You walk in forgotten halls, children of the West. The forges have not cooled, the Master has not left, and the darkness remembers. The voice came not from beyond the gate, but from within their minds. Kaldor staggered, clutching his head. Sared dropped to one knee, her spear raised in defense. Thrain bellowed a curse and struck the wall with his axe. But the voice only laughed, soft and terrible. Then silence. The gate stood still, but now it seemed to watch them. The company stood in uneasy quiet, and in that stillness Kaldor felt the first stirring of fear, not for himself, but for what might come if they failed. For if this was truly the forgotten servant of Morgoth, and if the orcs had begun to awaken the forge spirit bound in this place, then the War of the Ring had not ended. It had only paused, and the next shadow might rise before the sun could set. The gate did not yield at their touch, nor did it open with any visible mechanism. But as the last echoes of that dreadful voice faded into the walls, a low groan began to rise from the stone beneath their feet. Slowly, ponderously, the black iron parted inwards, folding like the lid of a tomb, revealing a passage that sloped downward into red-lit gloom. A warmth flowed from within, not the dry heat of fire, but a moist and suffocating breath, like that which escapes from deep caverns in the heart of the earth, long sealed. They stood for a moment on the threshold, as if each were listening not to the silence ahead, but to the deeper murmurings of their own thoughts. Kalura's grip tightened on the hilt of his blade. The torch held high above his head, casting long, flickering shadows upon the walls. Sared did not speak, but her eyes gleamed with some inner fire, and though her brow was furrowed, she showed no sign of fear. Thrain only nodded, his jaw set, the lines of age and battle deepening in the half-light. The descent was long and curved, a spiral hewn with precision and dark artistry. Along the walls were carvings, reliefs in the stone that seemed to twist and writhe as the torch passed them, depicting scenes not of conquest or glory, but of creation twisted into torment. Blacksmiths with empty eyes shaping chains from the limbs of their prisoners. Beasts with many limbs dragging iron carts through fire-lit pits. And always at the heart of each carving, the figure of a smith cloaked in shadow, his face obscured by helm or hood, his hands ablaze with unholy flame. "This is no forge of the dwarves," Thrain muttered, though none had spoken. "This is a place of unmaking." They did not answer, for what words could touch the unease that gripped them? They pressed on, and the passage ended in a wide hall with a domed ceiling lost in darkness. Here the air shimmered with heat, and the sound of hammer upon anvil rang faintly, though no smith could be seen. Across the floor ran channels of glowing molten ore, not gold nor silver, but some darker metal with a dull red sheen that pulsed like blood in open veins. Kaldor stepped wearily onto the stone floor, and with each step the temperature rose. At the far end of the hall stood an altar of basalt shaped like a great anvil, and upon it lay remnants of armor, blackened, scorched, half melted, as if some force had attempted to remake them and failed. Around the anvil the ground was etched with runes so old that even Sared could not name them. And behind the altar a figure knelt, and they froze, not daring to speak. The figure was wrapped in torn robes the color of rust and dried blood. Chains hung from its arms and shoulders, and its head was bowed. For a moment it did not move, and Kaldor almost believed it to be a statue. Then, with a slow and creaking motion, it raised its head. Its eyes burned like twin coals, not with light, but with memory. There was no flesh visible beneath the hood, only shadow, and the faint outline of a face once proud, now worn thin by time and agony. Its voice came not from its mouth, but from the very walls around them. "You have come," it said with a sound like iron scraping against iron. "The Watcher of the West, the Child of Fire, the Son of..." The wheel turns again. None of the three spoke. The figure rose, chains clinking, and as it did, the flames in the molten channels flared higher, casting leaping light upon the walls. The smith, for surely this was he, gestured to the altar. "Do you know what was for?" it asked. In the days before Sauron took his master's mantle, when the world was young and the will of Morgoth still burned in hidden hearts, Thrain stepped forward, his voice gruff. "You speak in riddles. We are not lore masters, nor are we fools. Say what you mean, shadow thing." The smith turned toward him, and though no face could be seen beneath the hood, Thraw stepped back, sweat beading upon his brow. "Once," the smith said, "I forged the instruments of war. Not weapons, but engines, devices meant to bend the wills of lesser beings. I shaped them not in the image of men or elves or dwarves, but in that of their fears. I was called Asgaru, and I served no master but flame and fury." Kaldor stepped forward. "Now you were buried, slain, your forge sealed beneath the dark tower. How is it that you speak?" "I do not live," came the answer, "nor am I dead. I was bound by treachery, sealed by those who feared what I would become. Sauron did not destroy me. He used me. He fed upon the remnants of my craft, yet denied me form. Now, with the tower fallen, the chains loosen, the forges stir, and the orcs, those pitiful remnants, seek a new master." "Then you mean to rise in his stead," Sarah said, her voice like the whisper of steel drawn from its sheath. There was silence, long and heavy. "I mean to finish what was begun," Asgaru said at last. "Not for Sauron, nor for Morgoth, but for the fire that consumes all order. I will reshape this land, not with armies, but with creation. The Dark Tower fell, but the forge endures." As he spoke, shapes began to stir in the shadows behind him. Figures of iron and flesh half-eyed, their bodies twisted as though some design had gone airy. Limbs fused with blades, faces half-formed, eyeless and silent. They stood still, yet menace clung to them like soot to flame. "You will not leave this place," Asgaru said, "not with the knowledge you carry." Thrain raised his axe and Sarah her spear, but Kaldor did not draw. His eyes were fixed upon the smith, and he saw now that the chains which bound him were not iron alone. They were runes etched into his form, forged of light and word. They held him still, but only just. "If the forge is your heart," Sared said, "then perhaps it can be quenched." He threw his torch into the nearest channel of molten metal, and at once the flame surged wildly. The light caught upon barrels of oil stacked along the walls, left perhaps by orcs or by those who had tried to unseal the vault. With a cry, Sir hurled her spear, striking one barrel cleanly, and flame erupted in a sudden storm. As Geralt howled, not in pain but in fury, As the chambers shook, the floor split, the ceiling groaned, and the half-forged abominations began to lurch forward, their movements jerky and unstable. "Run!" Quiller cried, seizing Thrall by the arm as the hall began to collapse. They fled up the sloping corridor, fire chasing them like a living beast. The sound of chains breaking and stone cracking echoing behind. Seer came last, her red cloak all light, her face grim but unafraid. They burst from the gate as it crashed down behind them, the forge hall sealed once more in a thunder of falling rock. For a long while they said nothing. The sky above was dark, the stars choked by ash, and the wind carried with it the faint scent of something still burning deep below. At last Sared spoke. "Is not dead?" "No," Culver said, "but he is buried, and his power, at least for now, lies broken," Brain grunted. "Then we buy time. That's all we ever do. Delay the next shadow." Kaldor looked east toward the blackened horizon where Bearer had once stood. Sometimes, he said, a little time is all that's needed to find hope. The fire behind them dimmed at last, muffled and buried beneath countless tons of stone. Yet the heat still hung in the air like breath on a forge bellows, and the earth beneath their boots seemed to thrum with a slow, sulking anger, as though the land itself resented the interference. The three companions stood upon a ledge of black stone overlooking the wide expanse of Gorgoroth, the barren plains stretching eastward in a vast sweep of ash and ruin. The sky above was heavy with a ceiling of low clouds, strick with smoke and tinged faintly with the deep crimson of unseen fires still smoldering far below. Here, even in the wake of their flight, the silence held fast. Not the peace of a resting land, but the tense stillness of something wounded licking its wounds. "Wait." Kaldor knelt by the edge of the ledge, brushing his fingers along a ridge of stone where fresh cracks had begun to spider out from the cliff face. He could feel it beneath his touch, deep and old, but living. The mountains still remembered the darkness. Though they had sealed the forge hall and buried Asgaru beneath its wreck, Kaldor knew with the certainty of one who had walked long years in war that the work was far from done. The smith might lie chained once more, but the hammer had struck, and the echo had not yet ceased. "We must not remain here," he said at last, rising to his feet. "The sound will have traveled. If there are orcs left in the ashlands, they will come like flies to Corellian." Brain, who had seated himself upon a low boulder and was polishing the soot from the head of his axe with the hem of his cloak, looked up and nodded grimly. "Let them come. After what we've seen, a few ash-bitten maggots would be a mercy." But Sared did not smile. She stood apart from them, her spear planted in the ground beside her, eyes fixed on the eastern distance, where the jagged crown of Barad-dûr's ruins still loomed like a broken tooth against the sky. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a fire in her gaze that no smoke could dim. "They're whispers in the wind," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. "Words spoken in the tongue of my forefathers, not prayers, but commands." Sared turned to her, his face drawn and solemn. "What do they say?" She did not answer at once. Her hand tightened on the haft of her spear, and only after a long moment did she speak again, her voice low. "They say, he who burns shall rise, he who is bound shall bind, and turn grain spat into the dust. Curse their riddles. I have had my fill of half-spoken warnings and talk of flame." But Seer's eyes did not waver. "It is no riddle. It is prophecy, one from the ancient south, kept hidden even from the captains of the Haradrim. My mother whispered it once, when I was still a child, and the Dark Lord had not yet claimed our banners. She said the true fire would come not from the west, nor from the east, but from the depths of the world itself, born anew in the bones of mountains. Asgaru Kaldor said, or something worse, Sarah replied. A hush fell between them, then heavy and long, and not even the whispering of the wind disturbed it. The day was waning, though in that land it was difficult to mark the hours, for no sun could be clearly seen, only the pale hint of light straining through the cloak of ash. They did not speak again until the last of the forge heat had faded from the stones, and the air grew cold once more. The chill that seeps into all places where shadow has long reigned. They descended from the ledge and passed into the lower valleys where the remains of Sauron's fortresses lay scattered and sunken like the bones of a dead beast. The ruins of watchtowers, their great iron spikes twisted and blackened, stood like sentinels over craters filled with old slag and bones. Here and there the marks of recent movement could still be seen. Footprints, scraps of cloth, the faint stain of blood upon stone. That night they camped beneath the overhang of a shattered wall. Its upper stones collapsed inward, leaving a hollow space barely large enough for shelter. The fire they kindled was small and hidden, for though the forge had drawn the attention of every dark creature for leagues, they dared not invite further notice. Sleep came slow and uneasy, broken by half-heard sounds and dreams filled with smoke and metal. Kaldor dreamed of chains that moved on their own, and of a voice speaking in tongues he did not know, but whose meaning he could feel, an invitation and a threat, all in one. When the morning came, gray and bitter, they rose and continued eastward. The plain of Morgoth offered no comfort, only endless stone and grit, and the remains of war still untouched by time. They moved swiftly now, for Kaldor had determined they must reach the dead marshes before the next moon waned. There, perhaps they might find a path back to Aelion, or at the least send word to the king. But the road was not so simple. On the third day they came upon the ruins of a garrison, one of Sauron's old strongholds, long abandoned, its black gates sundered and its towers crumbling. Yet the signs of recent life were unmistakable. Fires had been lit within the inner court, and the smell of roasted meat still clung to the stones. Skins were stretched upon frames, and rusted weapons had been gathered into piles for repair. Orcs. Not the great hosts of the past, but something more cunning. A band, perhaps, or a tribe, scattered after the fall, and now seeking purpose. It was clear they had been drawn here by something, some call or signal, perhaps the rising of the forge fire, perhaps something older. Kaldor ordered silence and caution. They crept along the outer wall and into the broken keep, moving as shadows among shadows until they came upon the main hall. There, crouched before a fire pit filled with glowing coals, knelt a creature tall for an orc, its limbs long and scarred, its face gaunt and marked with the same flame sigil they had seen in the deep hall. It spoke in a guttural tongue to the gathered band, its voice rough but urgent. Sarah listened closely, her head tilted, and after a moment she translated. It speaks of the new fire, of a rebirth. He calls himself the Flame's voice, and he claims to have heard Asgaru's call in the darkness. Rain gripped his axe. Then it spreads already like wildfire beneath dry brush. Kaldor frowned, then looked at Sarah. Can you kill him with one strike? She nodded without hesitation. Then do so, he said. Sarah vanished into the gloom, and the others circled to the far side of the hall. When the spear flew, it flew swift and true, and the orc voice choked mid-sentence, falling back with the shaft buried in its throat. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then came the cries, howls of rage and terror, steel drawn, feet thundering on stone. Kaldor leapt into the fray with sword drawn, throw beside him like a hammer of stone, and Sarah whirled among the shadows, her blade a streak of fire. It was not a battle of glory, but of necessity, of survival. Blood was spilled, black and red, and when it was done, the hall was silent once more, littered with the dead. They stood among the bodies, breathless. Grim is spreading. Sarah said again, her voice like iron on stone. Kaldor nodded. Then we must end it before it burns beyond the Black Land. And so they turned their eyes toward Barad-dûr. The forge was buried. The herald silenced, but the shadow had not been vanquished. It had only found a new voice. The road eastward grew harsher still, and as the company passed deeper into the scorched lands where Barad once loomed, a silence fell upon them more profound than any before. It was not the quiet of peace, nor the hush of reverent woods, but a smothering stillness, as if the very stones dared not speak. No bird dared fly in that sky, no beast stirred in the ash-written valleys. The wind that passed between the jagged rocks whispered of old pain, and the ground beneath their feet held a memory of fire too deep to be forgotten. Eredor's ruins rose before them like the shattered crown of a fallen god. Where once the dark tower had stabbed at the heavens with its cruel spires, now only broken teeth of black stone remained. And yet the air around it was thick with unease, for not all that had been built in that place had crumbled. Deep within the earth, beneath the mountain of ruin, corridors and chambers still endured. Crypts of iron, vaults of shadow, and forges that had never known the touch of sunlight. It was toward these forgotten depths that the company turned their steps. They did not approach by the open road, for though the hosts of Mordor had long since been scattered, Kaldor knew the habits of dark things that dwelt in ruin. The main gate was no longer watched by the lidless eye, but the memory of its gaze still lingered. Instead, they made their way along the outer crags, seeking a narrow cliff in the rock known to only a few, a hidden stair that led down into the lower halls, once used by the smiths and slaves of the Dark Tower. Sarah found the path first, her eyes keen in the gloom, and they descended in silence. The stair cut into the very bones of the mountain, winding ever downward into gloom. Moss did not grow here, nor the white roots of cave flowers. Only ash and soot clung to the walls, and the dust of countless years, thick as the fallen snow of a poisoned winter. When at last the stairs opened onto a vast antechamber, the company paused, their breaths misting in the air despite the warmth that rose faintly from the stone. Columns of black basalt ringed the hall, twisted into shapes that resembled towers of writhing serpents or streams of frozen fire. And above them stretched a ceiling vaulted and domed, yet cracked and sagging, as if the very mountain pressed down in anger. At the far end stood a gate of dark steel, half open and marked with the sign they had seen before, the crowned flame, the eye of fire. Kaldor's hand went to the hilt of his sword, but he did not draw. The silence here was not empty, and his every step was measured. A great weight lay upon the air, as though each breath stirred the anger of the stone. Sarah passed him with a weary glance, her spear low and ready, and Thra came behind, his steps sure despite the uneven floor, for he had trod many deep places and knew the signs of living rock. It was Thra who spoke first. These halls were shaped by tools not made for mortal hands. See how the walls curve, how the stone weeps heat. This is no work of orc or troll. This was made by something older. Kaldor nodded. Asgaru. Or by those he served, Sarah said quietly, her voice echoing faintly in the chamber. They passed through the gate and into the corridors beyond, where the ceiling grew lower and the air heavier still. Here the architecture changed, less ornate, more brutal. The walls were lined with iron plates, riveted and scarred, and the floor beneath their boots bore marks of chains dragged and talons scratched. The smell of old fire clung to every surface, not fresh but deep, as if it had seeped into the very marrow of the stone. As they passed through a broken arch, they entered what had once been a forge chamber, smaller than the great hall they had sealed days before, but still vast by the measure of men. Cold furnaces loomed along the walls, their mouths gaping like the jaws of slain beasts. And in the center of the room stood a great table of stone, blackened by soot, and etched with strange runes, now half worn by time. On the table, scattered like toys, were the broken remains of armor, helms split asunder, breastplates warped by heat, and gauntlets with fingers still curled in agony. But it was the wall beyond that held them fast. A mural carved in bas-relief stretched across the black stone nearly 10 feet in height, depicting the forging of a great figure, its form not born of flesh, but of iron and fire, its head crowned with flame, its arms wrapped in chains that reached into the earth. Around it smaller forms toiled, not as servants, but as extensions of its will, half or cracked darkness and flame. Sared stepped closer, her brow furrowed. "This is not Sauron," she said slowly, tracing the edge of the flame crown with one finger. "It is older, more primal. This is the fire that the South feared before the Dark Lord came." Rain grunted. "And if I read these marks true, it is not merely prophecy. It is design." Kaldor turned a plan. The dwarf set a pattern laid down in stone. Asgaru did not serve blindly. He crafted his own dominion, one that would outlast Sauron's fall. He buried it here in the roots of the tower. "And now it awakens," Kaldor said. The air grew thick then, the torchlight dimming as if unseen breath sought to smother the flame. The very walls seemed to pulse, and a low sound deeper than thunder and slower than the grind of glaciers rolled through the stone. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the iron plates along the corridor walls groaned. Suddenly from one of the darkened alcoves, a sound rose, a metallic scuttling like claws upon stone. Sarah turned, spear raised, and Thra brought his axe to bear. From the gloom crawled a creature, small and hunched, its body fused with metal. Its face no longer that of any beast or orc, but a mask of iron riveted into what had once been flesh. It hissed as it moved, sparks flickering from joints ill-fitted, and its eyes glowed with a red light that pulsed in rhythm with the forge's buried heart. It did not speak, but lunged without warning, and the chamber erupted in movement. Kaldor met the thing head-on, his sword shearing through part of its arm before it struck him with a blow like a hammer. He staggered, rolled, and rose again. Thra charged, roaring, and brought his axe down with a blow that split the creature's skull and sent it clattering to the ground in a heap of twisted parts. But the sound had woken others. From every side passage and broken doorway came the scrape of movement, the low hum of unnatural voices, and the flickering of lights. Shapes emerged, some small, some towering, each bearing the marks of Asgaru's failed craftsmanship, each a mockery of life and will, bound by fire and hatred. "We must flee," Sir, backing toward the forge gate. "We cannot stand here."
"No," Kaldor said. "We must find the heart of it. If this was his plan, if this is where he meant to rise again, then there must be a root, a place of power. We must reach it, or this will spread beyond these halls." "Then we go forward," said Thraw grimly, "to the very throat of the flame."
And so they turned, not toward safety, but deeper into the broken belly of Barad-dûr, where the last darkness of Mordor waited, not silent, but singing in steel and ash. The corridors beneath the Black Tower narrowed as they pressed deeper, their steps now shadowed not merely by ruin, but by the breath of things which should not have stirred. The stone underfoot was no longer flat nor natural, but had been shaped and scored by tools of malice, by instruments whose designs had long since passed from the memories of men, dwarves, or elves. Walls that once had borne the sigils of Sauron now laid defaced, overwritten by fresh markings. Glyphs etched in blood and fire, their meaning twisted and veiled in darkness. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to press in around them, until it was no longer mere warmth they felt, but the presence of a will, slow and watchful, waiting like a coiled serpent beneath the mountain's bones. Thrain led now, his eyes keener in the blackness than those of the others, and his voice was a steady mutter as he named the turns and the bends in the stone with grim precision. Dwarves had long memory for the shape of delving places, and though this was no hall of his kin, he read the slope of the earth and the pattern of the stone with instinct bred from the forges of Erebor and the deep roads beneath the lonely mountain. Cedar came behind, his blade ever drawn, though he knew it would not be steel alone that would serve them here. Sarah, ever silent, brought up the rear, her spear in hand, her eyes flicking always behind, for there was a sound at their heels, like the skittering of many legs upon stone, though whenever they turned, nothing was seen. At length they came to a chamber unlike the others. The entrance was framed by two pillars, wrought of black glass, veined with a red glow that pulsed faintly as though blood ran within the very stone. Beyond the arch the ceiling rose high and vanished into gloom, and the floor was laid not with slabs of stone, but with a mosaic of shattered armor, blades, and bone. In the heart of the chamber stood a great forge, silent now, but not cold. Heat radiated from it still, not in flame, but in a low shimmer that blurred the air, as if the forge were dreaming. And upon the dais behind the forge, wrought of twisted iron and bound in chain, stood a throne. It was a hideous thing, made not for comfort or majesty, but as a symbol of dominion. Its arms were shaped like claws, its back like a gaping M, and around its base coiled serpents of black steel, whose eyes blinked with red fire. The throne was empty, but not unclaimed. Above it, suspended in the air, without cord or beam, hung a helm. It turned slowly in the air as if upon an unseen axis, and its face was a mask of molten metal, featureless but for a single slit shaped like a flame. From within that slit came a dull red glow, steady and unblinking. None of them spoke. Even Thra, whose tongue was seldom stayed by fear, held his silence. Kaldor stepped forward, his voice low. "This is the source," he said. "Not the body of Asgaru. His will, his craft, all bound to this."
Teret moved to stand beside him, her spear tip lowered toward the helm. It is not merely a relic, it waits. Brain shook his head slowly, his gaze locked upon the throne. No, it watches. As if in answer, the glow within the helm brightened, and the forge behind them stirred. A soft, hissing sound arose, the sound of metal heating, of bellows creaking under their own weight. The chains upon the throne clinked softly, and from the far corners of the chamber came a whisper, at first so faint it seemed no more than the rustle of dust. But the whisper grew, wordless but insistent, and with it came movement, subtle at first, a shift in the air, a stirring in the corners, and then more figures emerged. They did not walk as orcs did, nor with the shambling gait of the dead, but with a dreadful grace, as if they had forgotten what it meant to move, and were only now remembering. Some were tall and slender, their limbs made not of flesh, but iron, twisted into forms that echoed once living men. Others were smaller, hunched and insectile, with clawed hands and eyes like coals. They made no cry, no growl of hatred, but only circled slowly around the edge of the chamber, their attention fixed upon the intruders. Then the helm spoke. The voice did not come from it alone, but from every stone, from the iron of the throne, from the very air itself. You have come too far. The sound was like the roar of a furnace slowed to a whisper, like fire speaking in sleep. Kaldor stepped forward, his blade raised. "We came to end this," he said, and his voice was clear, though his heart pounded like a war drum. The helm turned slowly to face him. Though it had no eyes, you cannot end what was forged before the waking of your world. I am no shadow of Sauron. He was but a flicker. I am the flame beneath. Sarah stepped beside Kaldor, her voice strong. You were chained and buried. You are a memory, not a master. I am memory, and memory endures. Even ashes remember the fire. At those words, the forge behind them flared with sudden heat, and the floor of the chamber cracked with a deep groan. From the veins of stone, molten metal began to seep, slow and glowing, creeping toward the center where the three now stood. Kaldor turned to the others. We must strike now. Destroy the helm. It is the heart. Brain's eyes gleamed with grim resolve. Then let's see if it breaks like iron. The dwarf sprang forward, his axe raised high, and with a cry he brought it down upon the helm. But as the blade struck, a flash of light erupted from the contact, and Thra was flung backward, his axe ringing against the floor. The helm did not fall. Sared did not hesitate. She spun her spear once and hurled it, the tip glowing red with heat as it flew through the chamber. It struck the helm dead center, and for a moment the flame within the slit wavered. The whispering stopped. Then all at once the figures around them shrieked in one voice, a sound like tearing metal and breaking stone, and surged inward. Kaldor caught Thra's arm and pulled him to his feet, even as the first of the creatures reached them. Blade met claw, spear met steel, and the forge chamber became a storm of fury. Sarah fought like fire incarnate, her limbs moving with deadly grace, and Thra bellowed as he swung his axe in wide arcs, cutting down whatever came near. Kaldor fought with the cold precision of a seasoned soldier, his strikes clean, his focus unshaken. But for every creature they felled, another rose from the shadows. They began to fall back, step by step, toward the broken arch, toward whatever safety the passage beyond might still offer. Behind them, the helm still hovered, untouched, pulsing with a deeper light. And then Kalo saw it. Not far from the base of the throne, half buried beneath the floor of blades and bones, lay a chain, not forged of iron alone, but of light-ringed links, glowing faintly with the same sigils he had seen in the forge chamber where Asgar's body had once. The chain trembled, as if it resisted its own unmaking. Kaldor knew what must be done. He shouted to the others, though his voice was nearly lost in the din. "The chain! The seal! Break it!" Thra turned, saw the chain, and without a word hurled his axe. It flew true, and where it struck, the floor split with a sound like thunder. Light burst forth from the break, not the fire of the forge, but a searing white radiance that pierced the gloom. The helm shrieked, not in speech, but in fury, and the creatures around them faltered. Sarah threw her last blade, driving it into the center of the break, and the chamber cracked open. From beneath the floor rose a blast of heat and light so fierce it blinded them, and the helm at last fell, clattering to the ground as its glow died. In the silence that followed, only the sound of dripping metal remained, as Ga's voice did not rise again. The fire beneath the mountain had been quenched, but the ruin of Barad-dûr was far from still. The chamber lay broken in silence, and for a time none among them moved. The pale light of the shattered seal lingered like mist above the ground, casting long shadows that danced across the scorched walls and over the scorched remains of the dark throne. The helm that had hovered above it no longer glowed, but rested lifeless on the stone, its flame extinguished. A faint ringing still filled the air, not of any bell or blade, but the sound that follows a great sundering, a silence so deep it hums. Kaldor stood amid the ruin, breath heavy in his chest, his sword arm slack at his side. His cloak had been torn, and his shoulder bled where one of the forge-worn things had rat him. He felt neither pain nor triumph, only the tremble that follows. Great danger past. Around him lay the bodies of the half-wrought, their limbs twisted in death as in life, steam rising from their frames as the last heat of the forge died with them. Tiaret leaned upon her spear, though her eyes were still fierce, and her hair, black and tangled, clung to her face with sweat. She did not look upon the helm, but upon the throne itself, as though wary that it too might stir. Thrain knelt beside the broken floor, where the radiant chain had snapped and fallen away into motes of light. His brow was furrowed, and in his hands he held the head of his axe, now cracked along the edge, a flaw he had not seen before. "That chain was no craft of evil," he said at length, his voice low. "It was made to bind, yes, but with purpose, with wisdom. Not all that lies in shadow is laid there in malice." Kaldor stepped forward and lifted the fallen helm, turning it in his hands. It was light, far lighter than the iron should be, and though the glow within had vanished, he thought he felt something faint and fleeting, as though a memory still clung to its shape. "Asgaru is ended," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. And yet, even as the words left his lips, they rang hollow in his ears. Sarah approached and touched the helm lightly with her fingers, then withdrew. "No," she said, "not ended, unbound." The torchlight flickered then, as though a wind passed through the chamber. But there was no wind in the deeps of Barad-dûr, only breath long held and now exhaled. They did not linger. The ruin was unstable now, the very stones groaning beneath their feet, as if the weight of the mountain, held in check by Asgaru's chains and forgecraft, now sagged upon its wounded heart. The halls they had entered in silence now trembled with a rumor of collapse. From far off came the crack of falling rock and the whisper of fire dying in its cradle. They passed back through the corridors, past the mural of fire and flame-crowned shadow, and as they went, they saw that the carvings had changed. The lines of the stone were dimmer now, the flames less fierce, and in the eyes of the great figure there was no longer fire, but emptiness. The shapes around it had crumbled, and the mountain in the carving, once cracked with wrath, now bore no wound. At last they came again to the stair by which they had entered, and began the long climb up from the belly of the ruin. It was a hard ascent, and their limbs were heavy from battle and ash. But still they pressed on, for behind them the mountain murmured and heaved, and Sared feared it would not hold its shape for long. When at last they came once more into the light of day, they found the sky above had changed. The clouds of ash had parted, not fully, but enough for the sun to pierce through in narrow shafts, streaking the plain with gold, like the fingers of a hand reaching through smoke. The wind was rising, and with it came the scent of old fire being washed away. They made camp among the ruins of an old watchpost, where the bones of stone walls still stood, and the iron grates had long since rusted to dust. There, beneath a low sky and a pale moon rising, they rested, and in the stillness they spoke at last of what they had done. Kaldor turned the helm over in his hands again, and though it no longer burned, he found it difficult to cast aside. It was a smith, he said quietly, and in his mind he sought not conquest, but dominion through craft. His forge was his kingdom. He would have shaped the world not with armies, but with fire and chain. Thraw stirred the embers of their small fire with the haft of his axe. Worse than Sauron in some ways, the Dark Lord would have ruled one, but through fear and war. This one would have reshaped the bones of the world, burned away its form, and given it new shape like metal in the mold. Zareth sat with her back to the wind, her cloak drawn close, eyes fixed on the darkness to the east. "There are others," she said at last. "Not like him, perhaps, not so strong. But seeds remain in the east, in the south, in the ruins beneath forgotten cities. This was only one of many. A deep root, yes, but not the last." Kaldor nodded, and silence fell again, broken only by the sighing of the wind through the stones. As the fire dimmed and the stars brightened above them, he drew from his pack a scroll sealed in the wax of the king, and unrolled it upon his knee. It was blank, save for the royal crest, and the words he had been told to write when his task was ended. His hand moved slowly, and the words were few. "The forge is broken. The shadow sleeps, but the fire still smolders." He rolled the parchment again and sealed it. "We ride west at dawn," he said. The others gave no word, but their eyes met his, and in them he saw the same understanding. Their task had not ended in glory, nor had it lifted the shadow entirely from the world, but it had struck a blow, and for a time at least, the dark would not rise. In the gray light of morning they rode from the ruins of Barad, 3 shadows against the rising sun, and behind them the mountain whispered, "No more." Yet far beneath, in a chamber sealed by fire and buried in stone, the broken helm lay silent. And though the flame was gone, the forge remembered. Through the desolation of Morgoth they rode, their path winding like a scar across the face of the black land. The ashen winds blew low about their feet, and the skies, though softened in hue since the unbinding of Asgaru's forge, remained veiled in a dull mantle of cloud. The very air seemed to bear the taste of old ruin, the breath of a land which had been wounded deep,
and though the fire beneath the mountain no longer stirred with malice, the earth had not yet forgotten its torment. No word passed between them as they departed the shadow of Barad-dûr, for each was held in thought, and the silence was not born of sorrow nor of dread, but of weariness, the kind that settles into the soul and leaves a man marked thereafter. Kaldor rode at the head, his gaze fixed westward toward the far line of the effluath, though the mountains remained hidden behind veils of dust. Then followed, his countenance grim and contemplative, for his people had long memory, and the things he had seen in the deeps would not soon leave his heart. Sared brought up the rear, her red cloak fluttering like a banner of forgotten war, her eyes ever watchful, ever wary. They passed by the wrecks of towers once tall, their stones cast down by the wrath of the earth in the moment of Sauron's fall. They saw the scorched husks of siege engines, broken and charred, half buried in the plains, where the armies of the West had once fought a battle on the very threshold of the Black Gate. In that place, too many had died for the sake of hope, and though victory had been won, the scars of that war still lay open upon the land. On the second day, they came to the edge of a barren lake, a wide, still mirror of black water nestled in the hollows of ancient slag heaps. Nothing lived in its depths, nor upon its shores, and the stones there were smooth and round, worn not by time, but by heat. The wind here carried no sound, and even the tread of their mounts seemed muffled, as though the land itself had no desire to echo life. They made camp in a shallow ravine nearby, screened by jagged rocks, and lit no fire, for in that place the darkness was not yet gone, and caution was their truest ally. As the sun faded behind the veiled horizon, Kaldor sat apart from the others, his hand upon the hilt of his sword, his eyes drawn ever eastward. In the silence of the twilight, he could still hear it, the faint hammering that had once filled the forge hall beneath Barad-dûr, the rhythm of a will that had sought to shape the world anew. He did not fear it now, for the chain had been broken, the helm cast down. Yet he could not forget the voice that had spoken from the very stone. I am the flame beneath. He knew well enough the cost of prophecy and the weight of names. Asgaru had not been born in the world of men, nor had he risen in the manner of mortal kings. He was a fragment of an older shadow, a spark left smoldering from the great fires of the First Age. And such embers, even when quenched, left their mark upon the fabric of things. Sarah approached in silence and sat beside him. For a time she said nothing, but when she did speak, her voice was soft and without its usual fire. You do not sleep, Kaldor shook his head. Sleep will come, but dreams are less kind than the waking dark. She nodded slowly. The helm remains behind us, broken and buried, but the memory of it walks with us still. It is not only memory, he said, looking into the gloom. It is a warning. There are fires yet unkindled in places we cannot see. You glanced at him, her gaze sharp despite her weariness. You believe this was only the first? He did not answer immediately. When he did, it was with the same quiet weight that had settled upon his voice since they had fled the fort hall. There are powers that endure in silence. Deep beneath the roots of the world, in places where the light of stars is never shone. Asgaru was one such power, forgotten, yes, but not lost. Now he is undone. But if such as he can stir again after ages uncounted, then who can say what lies in the deep south, or beneath the seas, or in the halls of the distant east? Thra had joined them, and he sank down upon a rock nearby with a heavy sigh, the sound more like the settling of stone than breath. He looked from one to the other, and his voice was gruff, but not unkind. "I have spoken with elves in years past, who told tales of the early days of Morgoth, servants scattered like seeds across the world when their master fell. Many were hunted, some were slain, but some simply vanished. Perhaps Asgaru was one of these, hiding beneath Sauron's shadow, waiting. Perhaps there are others sleeping still. And if they wake?" Sared asked. Thrain lifted a shoulder. "Then we do as we have done now. Kaldor stand, and we fight." Kaldor smiled faintly, though the expression held little warmth. Easy words when the fire has passed. But what if the next shadow rises where no sword may reach? "Then we find another way," said Sared. "There are many weapons in the world, and not all are forged of steel." The wind shifted then, and from the east came a faint lightening of the sky, a wan glow, not of sun nor moon, but of some distant flame still burning in the heart of the ruined tower. It flickered like a star behind smoke and then was gone. They watched it in silence. The days that followed brought no further threat, though the land remained bleak. On the 5th day, they passed beyond the rim of Gorgoroth, and the first stunted trees of Ithilien could be seen upon the horizon. Here the air grew sweeter, though the memory of the east lingered in every breath. Birds flew overhead once more, and green things stirred beneath the stones, shy and uncertain. They came at last to the watch-post on the borders of Gondor, where banners flew beneath the stars, and the torches of the wardens burned in defiance of all that had come before. There Kaldor gave the scroll into the keeping of a rider who sped it west to Minas Tirith beneath the cover of night. The company themselves remained for a time, not out of command, but out of need, for they had been wounded in ways that no healer's hand could mend at once. When word returned from the White City, it bore the seal of the king and a message written in his own hand. The words were few, but they spoke with weight. "The flame is quenched. Let the ashes rest, but do not forget where they fell. Watch the east and guard the old wounds. Peace is won by those who remember." So it was that Kaldor, Thra, and Sared remained in the borderlands for a time, watching the shadows of the Ethel Duoth with weary eyes, speaking little of what they had seen beneath the mountain. Yet those who passed through the watchpost spoke of them in quiet tones, of the Ashwalker returned from the heart of Mordor, of the dwarf who bore a cracked axe but would not part with it, and of the woman with a red cloak and a gaze like burning coals. And in the east, far from the green fields of Gondor, the winds whispered still through the broken stones of Barad-dûr. Beneath the ruin, the forge lay cold, but in the depths of the world the fire was not yet wholly gone. Bring had come to the borders of Aelion, though in truth it arrived softly and with sorrow, for the land still bore the wounds of long war, and the green shoots that pushed through the ash and broken stone did so with a weary hesitation of a people who had once suffered fire. Yet the trees here, young and old, grew stronger each year, and the rivers, once fouled by the poisons of the Black Land, now ran clear again, though they murmured dark memories as they flowed past the ruins of watchfires and outposts long abandoned. Kaldor stood upon a ridge beneath the gray-green canopy of a growing beechwood, his cloak stirring in the breeze that rolled westward from Mordor's bones. Behind him the towers of Gondor lay distant but clear, their white stone gleaming like stars beneath the morning sun. Yet his gaze never turned westward. Always his eyes were drawn east to the jagged line of the Duath, and beyond that veil of cloud and stone where the shadow once ruled. His wound had healed but slowly. The gash upon his shoulder had been shallow, yet what had clung to the blade that struck him was more than steel. It had been the craft of Asgaru, and that forge magic left a sickness in the flesh that even the king's healers had struggled to cleanse. Still, Kaldor endured, and as his strength returned, so too did the fire of his purpose. Brain, too, remained in the borderlands, though many messengers from Erebor had come, bearing word of home and entreaties for his return. He answered them with honor, but stayed nonetheless, and some whispered that the dwarf had taken an oath upon the broken helm, though he never spoke of it. He had taken up his hammer once more, not to forge weapons, but to mend the broken gates and fallen watchs along the border. Wherever the stone bore signs of ancient ruin, Thra set his hand to it, not merely to repair, but to unmake the hidden sigils and burnt markings that might yet call to darker things. There was no pride in his labor, but the grim joy of duty well kept, and in this he found peace. Darret was seldom seen by day. She came and went like the wind, always on the move, slipping into the passes of the eastern range or vanishing into the thick woods of Harandor, where the king's reach was still young. What errand she followed she did not say, but she bore with her a small shard of the forge's chain, broken and blackened, but still faintly warm to the touch. She claimed it was a talisman, a sign of what had been on. Others believed it a warning. It was on a night of silver mist that Kaldor was summoned to the watchtower by the border, where a rider from Minister Tirth had arrived under a secret seal. The message was brief, written in the firm hand of Famir, Prince of Aelion, and bore the command of Kingar himself. A shadow stirs in Lithlad. Scouts have vanished. The dead walk in the hollows by night. You are called again to serve. Kaldor read the letter by the firelight, then folded it and said nothing for a long while. The silence in the room was deep. Only the soft crackle of flame and the wind beyond the stones gave answer. Later, as dawn broke over the hills, he found Thra by a crumbled parapet, where he was hammering new bolts into the frame of a gate that had been splintered in the War of the Ring. The dwarf looked up as the ranger approached, and waited, leaning on his tool. "There is word," Sared said, and passed him the scroll. Thrain read it once, snorted, and handed it back. "Then it begins again." "It never ended," Kaldor replied. That evening they met Sarah upon the banks of a stream not far from the camp, where she had returned from the south with dust upon her boots and the scent of foreign lands upon her cloak. She did not speak, but when Kaldor showed her the message, she simply nodded and unbuckled her spear from her back. So it was that the three were summoned once more, and without fanfare or the sound of horns, they set out across the land that still bore the scars of ancient flame. Their path took them north and east along the slopes of the Efeldu and down into Lithlad, that lonely and wind-swept region where even the orcs of Mordor had seldom lingered. For it was a land of hollows and sinkholes, of cliffs that crumbled into black chasms and plains that whispered with the voices of the lost. In the first age, it had been a place of wandering spirits, and in the second, a frontier for the forging of secret roads and hidden strongholds. In the third age, it had slept, forgotten, but never clean. There they found signs, campfires long dead, scattered bones of creatures not wholly orc nor beast, and cairns overturned, their stones scattered as if by hands, eager to awaken that which ought to lie still. The air was colder here than it should have been.
though the sun shone above, and the soil bore no life save a pale moss that grew in lines, not circles as if drawn by a patient hand. The stars at night were veiled, even when no cloud passed above, and their light seemed to falter when it fell upon the earth. They found a hollow on the third day, a deep depression in the ground where no water ran, though the stone was worn as if by ancient tides. At its center stood a monolith, half-toppled, etched with runes that none of them could read. Thra touched the stone and drew back at once, his face pale beneath his helm. "This is no craft of dwarf, or elf, or man," he said. "It is older, perhaps older than the tower itself." Kaldor studied the lines, his brow furrowed. "It calls," he said, "but not to us, to something beneath." Sarah laid her hand upon the hilt of her blade and turned her eyes to the darkness at the edge of the hollow. "There are whispers," she said, "but not in a tongue I know." That night they kept no fire and took turns at watch. Kaldor stood the last watch before dawn, his cloak wrapped tight about him, the stars dim overhead. It was then that he saw a movement. Not far from their camp, down in the hollow where the monolith lay, a figure stood, tall and pale, cloaked in tattered robes that stirred not with the wind. It raised no weapon, spoke no words, but its head turned slowly as if listening for something. Then it knelt and placed its hand upon the stone. Kaldor did not move, but the breath caught in his throat. The stone glowed faintly where the figure touched it, not brightly, but with a slow, pulsing light, as though some ember deep within the earth had heard and answered. And though no sound reached his ears, Kaldor felt it in his chest, a deep, slow tremor, like the beating of a heart, long still, now waking. He turned and roused the others, speaking no words, for none were needed. The fire was not gone. It had only moved elsewhere. The wind that swept over the hollow was dry and sharp, carrying with it the scent of stone newly broken, and a whisper beneath the air that spoke of something ancient rising. The figure in the ravine had vanished. Ere the first light of morning touched the peaks of the Efflu, and though Kaldor had kept his eyes fixed upon the place, no sound nor sign betrayed its passing. Yet the stone remained changed. That which had been cold and lifeless now bore a faint sheen, as if fire ran beneath the surface, hidden beneath the guise of age. They descended into the hollow at first light, the sky above the color of old steel, and the sun cloaked in a pale mist. The stone monolith stood silent, though it no longer seemed a relic of forgotten times, but a sentinel, watching, waiting. Sarah circled at once without speaking, her spear lowered, her hand brushing lightly against the moss that curled along its base. Thra muttered in Cole as he examined the runes, but his words were grim, and when he stood again, he shook his head. "These are marks of binding," he said at last, "but their shape is not right. The loops are too long, the angles broken. I know the crafts of my people and the tongues of many halls. But this was carved by hands that never forged for beauty. It was meant not to seal something in, but to hold it in place until it could rise." Kaldor stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the face of the stone. "This was a beacon," he said slowly. "A call, the one I saw in the night. He did not summon the fire, he woke it." The three stood in stillness. Then, as though the wind itself were holding its breath, the land around the hollow bore no mark of recent passing, and no tracks could be found in the dust. Yet all three knew by the weight in the air and the stillness in the bones of the earth that the moment of awakening had come. They made no fire that night, nor did they rest easy. Each kept watch in turn, and when Kaldor took the third and final watch before dawn, he sat beside the monolith in silence, his back to the stone, his blade across his knees. The stars above were faint, the sky barely touched with the first grays of morning. Then once more he felt it, the deep, slow rhythm, not a sound, but a feeling, like the echo of a hammer striking an anvil in some buried forge far beneath the roots of the world. He rose swiftly and called the others. They came without question, and together they watched as the monolith cracked along its center with a sound no louder than a breath. A narrow fissure opened from base to crown, and within, for the briefest instant, they saw a red light flare, faint and flickering, like the last breath of a dying flame. Then it was gone. The hollow shook, and from the far ridge a stone slid free and tumbled down with a crash. "We must follow this," Kaldor said at once. "It is not yet a fire, but the spark has caught. If we do not find its source, it will grow, and we shall not be able to stop it a second time." Thrain nodded grimly, adjusting the straps of his pack and tightening his cloak against the rising wind. "Then we go east. There are tunnels in these hills, old roads from the time before the war. The orcs used them to move unseen. If this thing stirs beneath, it will use those same paths." Sared did not speak, but she turned and began to climb the far slope without waiting. The others followed, and soon they passed beyond the line of sight from the hollow, descending into a narrow vale where the grass grew pale and sparse, and strange shapes lay beneath tarpaulin sheets of rock. Half-buried structures, weathered and broken, their purpose lost to time. They found the first entrance just before dusk, hidden behind a car of skulls, long whitened by sun and wind. The stones bore no name and no symbol save one, the crowned flame etched with careful reverence into the largest of the bones. "It follows us," Sarah said, her voice low. "That sign, it is not as gurus alone. It is older." Kaldor brushed away the moss and dust with the tip of his sword, revealing more carvings beneath. The shapes were not letters, but patterns, spirals within spirals, set like wheels within wheels, each connected by lines too fine to be made by orcish hand. They were waiting, he said, not merely hoping, not wandering blind in ruin. They had a map of sorts, a way to return. This is the road." Thrain grunted and shouldered his axe. "Then let's walk it and see what beast waits at the end." They descended into the dark. The tunnel sloped downward at a shallow angle, the stone damp with old moisture, and the air thick with the scent of rot and earth long unturned. The walls bore markings at intervals, none written, but carved like the teeth of great beasts, swirls of ridges and hollows that might have been decorative, or might have served some purpose long forgotten. Their torchlight danced upon them, casting shadows that seemed to shift and slither, though no sound followed save their own footfalls. Hours passed, and the road did not rise. They moved like ghosts beneath the world, and more than once Kaldor felt as though the stone itself was watching, listening, remembering each step. At last they came to a chamber carved from a single vast hollow of the rock, circular in shape, its ceiling lost in shadow, and its floor set with a pattern that echoed the forge rooms of Mordor. But this was older, less cruel, more methodical. In the center of the floor stood an altar, though it bore no sign of worship, only a great basin filled with fine gray ash. Sared approached and stirred the ash with the butt of her spear. Within the basin, half buried, lay a shape of metal, curved and delicate, the hilt of a blade so old that rust had not claimed it, as if the air itself feared to touch it. She lifted it slowly, and the ash poured from its edges, revealing a sword forged not for war, but for shaping. "It is a smith's blade," she said. "A king's," Thra added, his eyes narrowed. "Or something worse." Kaldor stepped forward and laid his hand upon the stone rim of the altar. It was cold, but in its heart there was a memory of fire, like the heartbeat he had felt before. "We are not at the end," he said quietly. "This is the threshold. Beyond this the fire waits. Not as gorillas forge, but the forge he fled from the first flame." The others looked to him. He met their gaze with steel in his voice. "We go on." And so, beyond the chamber of ash, they passed into the deeper dark where the light of the world had never touched, and the old songs of flame still lingered in the bones of the earth, waiting to be sung once more. Long into the dark they walked, the world above them forgotten, as though they journeyed not through the underways of stone, but into another age, deeper and more remote than even the elder days. The passage narrowed and widened in turn, never straight, but winding like the veins of fire that once laced the roots of Barad-dûr. Their torches burned low, yet the walls around them glimmered faintly with a sheen that did not come from the flame, but from within the stone itself, as though the mountain's bones still remembered the forging of the world. When flame and earth had not yet parted, and the valor had sung the shape of Arda into being, no sound came to them save the soft fall of their feet and the distant groaning of the stone, as if some great weight stirred in its sleep. The air grew warmer the deeper they pressed, not with the thick breath of forges, nor the choking heat of ash, but with a dry warmth that came from the rock itself, slow and steady, as if the world's own breath was drawn deep in its belly. The sword that Sarah had drawn from the altar remained unshaved, for no scabbard would take it. Its blade, though blackened with age, gleamed faintly in the torchlight, and along its spine were runes that none among them could read, not even Thra, who knew the speech of stone and the marks of many halls. But as they moved deeper, that strange sword began to hum, a soft and steady note that pulsed through the air like the low call of a distant horn. "This place is not hollow," Kaldor said, as they paused upon a stone bridge that crossed a crease so wide the torchlight could not touch its far side. "It is shaped not by water nor time. This was carved with purpose." Thra nodded, and his voice echoed like a drum. "I have seen the deep delvings of Barad-dûr and the secret mines of the Iron Hills. Never have I walked in halls such as these. The lines are too perfect, the angles too precise. This was not shaped by dwarves, nor men, nor elves. Then by whom?" Sarah asked, her gaze fixed upon the chasm below. Brain was silent a long time before he spoke again. "I do not know." They crossed the bridge without further word, and came at last to a doorway set into the wall of the mountain, vast and arched, without hinge or bar. Upon its face was no inscription, no mark of passage save one, burned into the black stone. A single symbol, the crowned flame, its edges glowing faintly as if touched by an ember that refused to die. Kaldor stepped forward and raised his torch, the light flickering across the carving. "This sign follows us like a shadow.
It was Asgaru's mark, but I do not think it was his to claim.
It was his master's, Sarah said, or his memory. Thra set his hand upon the door and drew it back at once. It is not sealed. It waits to be opened. Without further speech, Kaldor pressed both hands to the stone. A warmth rose beneath his fingers. Not the biting heat of fire, but something older, deeper, as though the mountain itself recognized him, or the blade he bore, with a groan like the bending of iron under great weight. The door began to open, folding inward upon itself without sound of gear or chain, revealing a wide chamber beyond, lit not by flame but by a soft and flickering light that came from the walls. They entered. The chamber was immense, shaped like a dome, and at its heart stood a forge, not like those of men, nor even the dark forges of Barad-dûr, but something older, crafted from the roots of the mountain itself. The anvil was a pillar of obsidian, its surface carved with circles and sigils of fire. The walls pulsed with lines of red and gold that moved like veins beneath the stone, and the air was filled with the scent of metal, raw, unfinished, potent. But what held their gaze was the figure that stood beside the forge. It was not tall nor monstrous, but cloaked in black, its face hidden beneath a helm that bore no slit, no crown, only a smooth, burnished surface, like molten glass cooled in shadow. The figure did not move, did not speak, but as they entered it turned its head slowly, as if listening to their footsteps upon the stone. The sword in Sarah's hand shivered, and the runes along its edge flared bright red. Kalu drew his own blade and stepped forward. "You are not Asgaru." The figure said nothing. Thra raised his axe. "Then speak, Shadow. If you are master here, we have come for your end." Still the figure did not reply, but slowly raised its hand, and the walls of the chamber trembled. The forge flared with sudden light, and from the stone itself came a sound, not of metal or flame, but of voices, countless, layered, whispering in tongues long dead. Then the voice of the figure came deep and cold, not from its throat, but from every stone in the hall. "I am not Asgaru. I am that which gave him name. I am the echo that shapes the flame. I am the first hammer." The light surged, and from the forge burst a wave of fire that passed, not like heat, but like wind, swirling around the company, casting their cloaks wide, their hair streaming. The weapons in their hands burned with light, and for a moment the air was filled with visions of dark towers rising in ancient lands, of forges burning in the hearts of dead mountains, of hands shaping weapons not for battle, but for rule. Then the light withdrew, and the chamber was still. Galern's voice was Horsero. "You were before Mordor, before even Morgoth's fall." The figure inclined its head slowly. "I was born in the song of the making. When the world was shaped, I listened. While the Valhall forged mountains and seas, I forged thought and will. I gave flame its hunger. I gave stone. I am the fire beneath." Sarah stepped forward now, her voice sharp. "Then it is you who stirred Asgaru. You who built the hidden forges. You who called—" "No," came the reply. "They came to me for power, for meaning. I did not command, I gave. What is forged must be tested. What is broken must be remade." Fra shook his head slowly. You are not a lord. You are a fire without hearth. You burn all that touches you." The figure turned toward him. "So speaks one who shapes stone with reverence. But even stone must crack to change." Kaldor raised his blade. "We will not allow another shadow to rise. This land is bled enough." The forge flared again, and the voice whispered from the walls. "Then strike, children of the fading world. Prove that you are stronger than the fire." And as the figure raised both hands, the chambers shook, and the forge awoke in full fury. The final test had begun. The forge roared to life, not with the wild chaos of a battlefield, but with the measured, terrible rhythm of something ancient fulfilling its design. Flames surged upward in a pillar of golden fire from the heart of the chamber, licking the walls with tongues of memory, and the veins of light in the stone pulsed faster as though the mountain's blood now flowed with purpose. The figure beside the anvil did not strike nor cry out, but stood with arms raised, and from its hands issued lines of fire that wove through the air like threads drawn from the looms of creation itself. Kaldor stepped forward first, the light of the forge glinting upon his blade, and for a moment he looked not like a Ranger of Gondor, but like a prince of forgotten wars, forged in shadow, crowned in ash. His voice rang out, not loud, but clear. "You may be older than kings, older than the tower and the black hand that built it, but your time is ended. The world does not need your flame." The figure's voice answered still from the walls, still without mouth or breath, and yet filled with power. "You do not understand. I do not burn for conquest. I burned to make, and the world that was made without me is flawed." Sarah moved beside Kaldor, the black sword in her hand now gleaming with scarlet flame, as if it had awakened fully in the presence of its maker. She spoke no words, but raised it high, and the hum that had haunted the deep grew into a song, low and resonant, not sung by voices but by the blade itself, singing of chains unbroken and fire contained. The sword had been meant to seal, not slay. Thrain came last, his axe now wrapped in cloth, for it had cracked once before upon Asgar's helm, and he had not reforged it. But his strength was not in weapons alone. With a growl that echoed through the hall like thunder through stone, he raised both hands. Grix struck the haft of his axe upon the floor 3 times. Each blow sounded like a drumbeat in the forge's song, and with each strike the fire faltered. "I am stone," he said, "and stone endures. You may burn, but you will not remake what was carved in truth." The figure lowered its arms. The forge dimmed slightly, and though no face could be seen beneath the helm, there was something in its stillness that changed, a hesitation, a ripple in the fire. "You are few," it said, 3 sparks in the dark. What hope do you bear against a fire that fed the mountains before your fathers walked beneath the sun?" Kaldor raised his sword, and his voice was steady. "Hope enough." And then the fire broke upon them. It came not in a single wave, but in layers, in pulses, in the wrath of a forgotten forge made manifest. The very air burned, and the stones beneath their feet groaned with the strain. From the walls burst forth shapes of fire, not creatures of flesh, but memories given form, echoes of the first servants, figures shaped like elves and men, but wrought of light and shadow, wielding blades of smoke and embers. They fought not to kill, but to delay. color met them first, his blade striking through flame, cutting form from formlessness.
The sword hissed with each blow, its edge glowing as though it drew light from the things it sundered. Sarah moved through the fire like wind through smoke, her red cloak streaming behind her, the black sword singing as it turned back the tide. Thra stood firm by the central anvil, holding the space with blows that shattered even the light, protecting the place where the fire was brightest. But the forge did not tire, and as the battle raged, Kaldor saw the figure, still motionless, still silent, draw from the air a second shape, a blade not of metal, but of fire itself, and place it upon the anvil. The air trembled. The fire bent toward the blade. "Hot way! It is forging," Kaldor cried. "He means to make another, not a servant, a king." Sarah's eyes flashed with fury. "Then we ended now." She raced to the anvil, leaping over fire and light, her blade held low. But as she struck, the blade in her hand shattered, not in splinters or shards, but in silence, falling like ash. She fell to her knees beside the forge, her hand empty. "No," Kaldor whispered, even as he fought back the flame-bore shades. But the broken blade did not die. Its remnants fell into the forge, and the fire recoiled, folding inward as if drawn down into itself. The figure turned for the first time uncertain, and the voice that had spoken with such shitty now trembled. "You have brought it here, the unmaking." The forge dimmed. The fire dulled to gold, then red. Thra reached into his cloak and drew forth a hammer, not his own, but a relic shaped long ago, taken from the ruins of Barad-dûr. He placed it upon the anvil beside the fire blade and spoke in Custul, a word of binding, a word of silence, a word of rest. And then Kald stepped forward, the last of their weapons in hand, and he struck the anvil once, twice, a third time, and the forge died. The light vanished. The fire guttered like a candle in the wind. The chamber shuddered, and from the walls came no voice, only silence, deep and pure, as though the mountain itself had drawn breath and held it. The figure at the forge fell Jigay knees, its helm cracked, and from beneath there was no face, only light. And then the light was gone. They left that place by a different road, a stair that wound upward into daylight, and when they emerged, the sun was rising above the mountains of shadow. The wind was cold, the sky was clear, and the land below lay still. They did not speak for many hours, for their hearts were heavy with what they had seen and what they had unmade. The fire was gone, yes, but in its death something had changed. The world had shifted, and in some deep place the echo of the first hammer had been silenced. When at last they returned to Ion, they did not bear trophies nor songs. They bore only memory and the weight of a task fulfilled. Kaldor returned to his watch, walking the ash-bound borders with quiet steps. Thra returned to Erebor at last, and spoke no word of what he had seen, save to his kin beneath the mountain, who added a new name to the secret halls. Sared vanished into the south, her red cloak fading into legend, and the sword she had broken became a tale told only in whispers and in the deep places of the world. The fire no longer spoke, but the stones remembered. And so ends the history of Mordor. Yet the world is not ended, nor ever